Okay, welcome everyone. This is day 3 of our crash course on the human dimensions of shark research and conservation. Today is the day when we get to actually see how these human dimensions, research methods, and other methods are actually applied in various field settings. So we have a bunch of case studies from all around the world today. But just like on other days, please remember to keep your microphones on mute because we have a lot of participants who are still coming in. We want to make sure that the Q&A is kept on the chat. So please feel free to put in your questions as and when you think of them. And we'll have a moderator today for the discussion who will keep track of the chat and incorporate your questions into the final discussion. Also, please be aware that we are recording the session so we can share them online later. So in case that affects you in any way, please just be aware of this. Today, the idea is that we will learn how to apply social science methods to different situations across the world. We'll understand the potential value of using these methods in terms of informing research and policy. And we will understand the value of specific things like local ecological knowledge or LEK, as well as Fisher's perceptions in really informing our research and conservation of sharks. We will also be aware of some of the practicalities and considerations for using these methods in different contexts. And most importantly, we will get to know some experts and additional resources that you might be able to use for your own work. So a brief introduction to the experts that we have today. We will start with Ruth Leaney, who is a researcher who's been working on sawfishes in multiple places. And she will be telling us about her search for sawfishes and the lessons she has learned from 7 years of interviews. Following this, we will have Mia Iwane, who unfortunately, just because of the time differences, cannot be here in person, but she's recorded her talk for us. She will be talking about applying a socio-political lens to shark research and conservation. Then we have Isa Sedu, who again has recorded his talk because he's unsure about his ability to be here for the whole time, thanks to internet, as many of us from developing countries know. He will be talking about using local ecological knowledge and citizen science to fill in the gaps for Ghana's shark fisheries. Then we have Sarah Al-Mabruk, who will be talking about social media and how to use it to and combine it with how to combine using social media with research, and talking about her lessons from angel sharks in Libya. And finally, we will have a panel discussion that will be facilitated by Vanessa Jaite from the University of Nottingham. So to learn a little bit more about our speakers, what we wanted to specifically point out is that we have speakers from all across the world. Ruth Leaney has worked along East Africa and also in Bangladesh. Isa Sedu works in Ghana. We have Mia Iwane, who is talking about Hawaii, and Sarah Al-Mabruk, who is going to be talking about her work from Libya. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Ruth, who can take over from me right now. Thank you.
Thank you, Divya. I'm just getting my presentation up. Okay, I hope everyone can see that, the presentation slides now.
Yes.
Great.
Um, we can't see the slide view though. Sorry, yes, now we can.
Okay, great. So thanks for the introduction and for the invitation to join the workshop, which is a great idea. I feel like I've been working in the field of using social science methods for about 12 or 13 years now. And it's really nice to see the progression from this being a less accepted method and something that was seen as sort of inferior to quantitative methods, to becoming something that the value of social science methods is becoming much more recognized. So I think that's wonderful. So just an outline of what I'm going to speak about today. I've published a lot of my work on swordfishes, and there are also several of my presentations about some of my findings from field studies online, so I can share the links to those presentations later on in this workshop. So I thought that rather than just reiterating those presentations and those findings again, given that they're pretty widely accessible, I would instead just share some of the key points that I've learned over this period of 7 years of specifically 7 years of doing interview surveys and focus groups to collect data on elasmobranchs and mostly on swordfishes. So I'm just going to give you a brief introduction to the work that I've done on swordfishes. Then I'll also briefly cover the methods that I used for those studies. I'll then talk about the lessons that I learned from using interview surveys and more qualitative methods over the years, and briefly discuss what I think are the opportunities, or some of the opportunities, for using this human dimensions approach. And I first, before I get into it, just want to acknowledge the privilege that has allowed me to work in so many places. It's been a huge learning experience for me, not just in terms of developing the methods that I've used, but also in terms of seeing my own privilege in being able to travel to other places where there isn't the same research capacity. And I've learned over the years that I think one of the key elements of my work, if I am going to continue to travel and work in low-income countries, is to ensure that I build capacity there and ensure that as many local people as possible become involved in that work. So Protect Africa's Swordfishes was founded by me in 2012. I started with a contract to collect data on baseline data on swordfishes in Guinea-Bissau in West Africa. And following from that, just became fascinated with the topic and with the dearth of data really on swordfishes throughout the African continent. So since then, I've done baseline studies myself in 9 countries, 6 of those in Africa, and then also the Philippines, PNG, and Papua New Guinea and Peru. And I've also collaborated with NGOs or supported studies being done by other students in 3 other countries. So as I mentioned, some of the results of these studies I've presented in a couple of different seminars that have been filmed, and that's a link to one of them there, but I'll share that link in the chat box later for those of you that are interested. And likewise, most of my studies have been published, and if you are interested in getting a hold of any of those papers, some of them are open access, lots of them aren't, so please do get in touch. So the research methods that I've used for generating a baseline data set on swordfishes in various different countries have been several. I've used historical ecology where possible, so I've gone looking for older publications And that could be scientific publications, but often it's things like old reports by explorers, looking through Google Books and using search terms in different languages, even things like this photo here on the right, looking for old photographs in books and images that that give us some sense of areas where sawfishes were present in the past. And then my primary method has been using social science methods to collect local ecological knowledge, or Fisheries ecological knowledge. It tends to be much broader than Fisheries. I tend to try and keep quite a wide scope with my interviewees to ensure that a lot of different experiences are incorporated. And then finally, while I've been in the field, I've also gone looking for sawfish rostra, these saws that sawfish have, and recorded morphometric data from those rostra. And what that does is it allows me to understand what species were present. So as I said, I'm just going to jump straight in here to the lessons learned. I think hopefully most of you in the audience have a good sense already of what qualitative methods involve. In my case, it was very much based around a questionnaire, but it was mixed methods. So there were some questions that were more quantitative, a lot of open-ended questions, and that allowed me to collect a real diversity of data. And through interviews, I was generally trying to get a handle on things like when people, firstly, whether people had ever encountered sawfish in their lives, and if they had, when was the last time they'd seen one. And that was just became a good indicator for whether it was likely that sawfish were still around in a particular area or not. And then in areas where sawfishes had been encountered somewhat regularly by my interviewees, I could then go into further detail with them to understand whether sawfishes were culturally important in that area, whether people relied on them as a source of food, or whether any other products from sawfishes were used, how important those products were as a source of income for people, and also things like what kinds of gear types were used to catch sawfishes most commonly. So that's just to give you an idea of the types of data that I was collecting. So the first lesson that I think I'm sure has become clear already throughout this workshop series is what interviews and community engagement can give us. And so I think one of my first big learnings in working in this sphere, having been trained initially as an ecologist and having done a lot of work that was very much separate from communities and from people, was that not only was I collecting data on the stuff that I ostensibly wanted to find out about, I was also getting to know people. I was seeing a part of their lives. I was seeing the socioeconomic conditions that they lived in. I was having to travel to the areas where they lived and worked. And so I was seeing those kind of conditions. And that gave me, and I think it gives all of us who do interviews in these sorts of contexts, it gives you an incredibly valuable insight into the much broader context in which you're working as a conservationist. So, sorry, slides won't move on. So it allows us to assess, first of all, as I said, the presence or absence of a species, and also doing interviews will allow you to understand better the threats that those species face in a particular area, and those might be directly threats posed by potentially your interviewees themselves, if you consider fishing a threat to a species, but it may also be indirectly through the observations your interviewees have made about pollution in a particular area, or deforestation, or something in their environment. And I think these insights are incredibly valuable, because as an interviewer who doesn't live in the area that you're studying, which doesn't apply to everyone, but does apply to me, you only have a certain amount of opportunity to understand what the local threats are to a habitat or a species. And that understanding will come largely from literature and whatever might be in the news. But by talking to local people, you get to understand a lot more about the things that might not make it to the news, the things that might be hidden. Sometimes it's something like mining activity or an illegal activity that's hidden, but finding out about those things can be incredibly useful. You also get to learn about the drivers of those threats. So if small-scale fishing is a threat to the species that you're interested in, then, as I said, by observing people's socio-economic conditions, by understanding their lives a little better, you start to understand what might be driving the fishing of that particular species. And that is incredibly valuable when it comes to designing conservation strategies for that species. You can also ask about whether a species has any cultural importance, and that's always been a really big interest of mine, just because I find it fascinating anyway, but also because there's a certain school of thought that says that potentially if a species is culturally important to a region or to a group of people, then that might help in developing locally relevant conservation strategies. That's not always a given, and it can also be seen as a little bit presumptuous to jump on board with a certain element of cultural importance if it serves a conservationist's needs. But it's always something I think that's a very valuable piece of information to have in one's toolbox. As I said, socioeconomic status of communities, and understanding that will then help you to understand what the barriers might be to a community or to an individual engaging in conservation. So when down the line, hopefully, you go from collecting those data about the species that you're interested in to developing conservation and management actions, obviously we want to develop actions that are as locally relevant and feasible as possible. And you can't do that unless you understand what might prevent local people from engaging in those activities. So it also helps by doing interviews and by engaging with communities. It really helps one to identify what needs there are in the community, like perhaps education on a particular species or on a particular environmental issue. Do people need alternative livelihoods? Are they so incredibly reliant on fishing that it's not viable to ask them to stop fishing a certain species or to stop fishing all elasmobranchs, for example? So all of these things are incredibly useful to know when developing conservation strategies. And it also helps you to know what the most appropriate communication routes might be. So if you go into a community and it turns out, as is the case in a lot of places where I've worked, that they don't have access to internet, I mean, certainly some places in Madagascar where I've worked, there's also very little phone signal. So then you know that anything that relies on internet, or assuming that people will see a video on YouTube, for example, is really not a practical approach. And one of the other things that I've noticed is that in some communities, people have had so little exposure to things like printed materials and books with really nice images in them, that they can be really captivated by and drawn to those kinds of materials. And so I've used those sort of observations that I've made tangential to my actual interview work to help me develop communication products that I think will appeal to the people I'm trying to reach. The second lesson is that different countries need different approaches. This is probably stating the obvious. for most of you. But what I learned over time and through the privilege of working in multiple different countries is that some issues that might arise in one country won't arise in another. For example, the trust of communities. When I worked in Guinea-Bissau, it had not too long ago come out of many, many years of civil war and huge unrest. And people were very distrustful of interviews in general, of being asked anything about their personal life. And certainly as a foreigner, it was very hard to, it just wasn't appropriate. And so I ended up working with an interview team there who asked most of the questions instead of me. As another example, in the Philippines, having worked in a number of countries on the African continent for many years, I did a baseline study in the Philippines 4 years ago, and just found the difference amazing in terms of the fact that the communities that I was interviewing there were super familiar with conservation work. They'd had lots of interactions with NGOs before. They had seen sawfish on TV. And so there was a lot more openness in terms of sharing information about sawfish with me, because people were just more habituated to talking to interviewers and to people involved in conservation. And I think that's just an interesting, it's not something you can always do anything about, but it's interesting to be aware of these differences that, between countries in the sort of contexts that you can work in. There's also a very different level of formality in terms of asking for permission to do interviews that's needed from one place to the next. In some countries, you need to have a formal piece of paper that's stamped by the local municipality. In other places, that's not required at all, but in many places in Africa, for example, you need to go to the local either village or community leader and have his or her verbal permission to carry out the study before you go ahead and approach people. So it's always incredibly valuable, imperative, I think, to be working with local groups who can inform you about those kind of technicalities and formalities. Another lesson that I learned is that images can be a really tricky thing. When I started working on sawfishes, this was sort of before the Sawfish Conservation Society Facebook page, for example, and website were up and live. And there weren't that many pictures back then of sawfishes around. And so from my interviews in Guinea-Bissau, I used a combination of this picture in the bottom left here, which was just a black and white line drawing from the guide to sharks and rays written by Bernard Serret. And then I combined that with a color image that I'd taken from a fisheries book, but it was a color photograph of a preserved sawfish. And I realized after I'd got going with the study that in fact people were really struggling to understand this image, this black and white line image. And this photo on the right hand side is the photo that I've used for most of my interview surveys since. It gives you a really clear sense of the shape of the sawfish. It's got a really clear view of the saw, and it's something that people can identify much more clearly with. Whereas images that are slightly more abstract, I mean, to me, a line drawing is not abstract, but if people are not familiar with looking at line drawings, it can be something that they don't always identify with. And I find that very much to be the case in Guinea-Bissau. Likewise, photos can also confuse people. So, for example, in Mozambique, I spoke to some fisheries observers, and they looked at my image, the one from the previous slide, the color photo of the sawfish, and they said, yeah, we see those sometimes brought up as bycatch in the shrimp trawlers. And I got very excited and asked them to send me photos next time they caught some of these sawfish as bycatch. And a few months later, I got a photograph emailed to me by one of the fisheries observers, and it was of this little beastie, which, although it was fascinating and wonderful to see, is not a sawfish, it's a saw shark. And so what this taught me is that sometimes people, if they've never seen sawfish before, but they've seen saw sharks, and then they see an image of an animal with a saw, they'll equate the two in their mind, because it's a pretty unusual feature for an animal to have. So I think it's an easy mistake to make. But this really highlights the importance of actually trying to verify reports of observations of the species you're interested in as much as possible. This definitely put a spanner in the works for some of the reports I had of sawfish from Mozambique. But on the plus side, what it did lead me to do was to develop an infographic that I could share in multiple languages with fisheries observers and also with interviewers in different places, to just explain what the difference was between these two groups of animals. And I think that people have found that quite helpful going forward, just in separating observations of sawfish from observations of saw sharks. Then in terms of literacy, it's really important to remember, or I have learned that it's important to take into consideration that the literacy levels of your interviewees may vary. I think Hollie mentioned in a previous day's workshop that you don't ever want to embarrass your interviewees. And I learned very quickly that this can be problematic with things like consent forms. And so I adapted my consent forms, because I asked for the consent of each interviewee prior to starting the interview. But I adapted those from a written one to a verbal one to make sure that people weren't embarrassed about not being able to write their names. Likewise, I usually ask for the age of my interviewees, and in some places people don't know their age. And so you have to be able to ask that in a very gentle way, and you have to be able to gloss over it very quickly if it turns out that the person doesn't know their age and doesn't have a record of their birth date. Understanding cultural norms. So again, this isn't so much of an issue if you're a local, if you're a researcher doing work in your own country, perhaps. But for me, it was a huge learning experience working in Africa, and finding that in some places, people weren't comfortable with saying, I don't know. So if you ask them a question and they didn't know the answer, they would feel like they should still give you an answer, either to be helpful or just because culturally it wasn't something that people were familiar with doing. And so there have had to be, I think it's just good to understand that sometimes if you see people struggling with giving you an answer, then you have to be flexible in giving them a get out clause, so to speak. And again, as I said before, if you're a local researcher working in your own country, then this is probably a lot less of an issue. And the importance of reflexivity, which I know has been brought up in previous talks as well, is also something I think is very important. A great example of this, to my mind, is the fact that when I was asking people what I thought were the causes of, or why did they think the number of sawfish in their region had declined over the course of their lifetime, a lot of people in some places would say overfishing. So, that sounds very familiar to me. That's all good, easy to note down. So the effect, which is the reduction in number of sawfishes, was clear and to both parties, both myself and the interviewee. And the cause that people was naming, overfishing, was also clear both to me and to the interviewee. But the effect, the bit in the middle that was causing this effect to happen, was very different in my mind and in the mind of many interviewees. So when I hear overfishing, I think, okay, more and more people are going out and they're catching more of these animals, which means there are fewer left to reproduce, and therefore the population declines. But when I actually started to drill down with some of these interviewees into what they understood to be the process of overfishing, they, not everyone, but many people said, well, more boats come, more fishers come, and so the sawfish run away, they swim away and they go to another area. So their understanding of overfishing was not that actually the population was getting smaller overall, but that the population was going somewhere else to escape from the boats and the nets. And whilst perhaps from a distance, you might say, well, what difference does it make if the effect is the same, that sawfish have gone from a region, then who cares what the process is? But I think the process is very important, and knowing what people's understanding of that process is also super important, because again, when you come to designing conservation strategies, if people just think the sawfish are going somewhere else, then they may say, well, you know, it's okay, why do we need to protect them? They've just gone somewhere else. Whereas if they understand that actually they're really gone, or they're disappearing, and it's not just that they're in another place, but that their population is actually declining severely, then perhaps it's a bit more of a driver for them to protect these animals. So I do think understanding that process is incredibly important, and drilling down into how people understand those processes can be incredibly valuable and fascinating. And then feedback and communication of results. I don't know how often this is done unless a researcher is part of a local NGO. I know some people are wonderful at doing it. Myself, as an independent researcher for many years, and as somebody who was funded largely by small grants, I rarely had the opportunity to go back to a place where I'd done a study and share the findings after I'd done the analysis. And I have a certain degree of guilt about that, because I feel like the flow of information should not be one way. When people are sharing their experiences with you, I think that it is only fair and right that you can then go back to them and explain to them how the time that they gave you has contributed to this much broader understanding. And that's also really important to conservation as well. And again, for those of you who are working in your own home country, I guess hopefully this is a little bit easier, in that perhaps you do have more scope to go back, but perhaps not always. Small grants don't always allow for multiple visits. And so creating relationships with NGOs who are present in the much longer term in an area is incredibly important, so that you can perhaps share your results digitally or share communication materials digitally with those NGOs or with other groups that can then share them with the communities. I'm aware that I've probably talked for too long already, so I'm going to zip through these last few slides. Hollie's already mentioned in a previous on a previous day that interviewing is an art, and I have really found that. And if you are working with teams of interviewers, I think it's really important to explain the importance of being able to rephrase questions and explain questions without giving the answer away. But it also comes down to, I think, something that some people are just find much more easy than others. And I found that by explaining the reasoning behind my study, by explaining the context of sawfish conservation and the declines in sawfish globally, and by getting people a little bit excited about these animals and really curious about them, that can actually really encourage interviewers to stray from the fixed questions on the questionnaire and to start asking questions a little bit, like a few extra questions that will get us some more information that's useful. Yeah, culture. I do think this one is super important. We as researchers and as researchers doing interviews are in the privileged position of potentially being able to record elements of declining traditions and culture. And I found myself in that position, especially in Papua New Guinea, which this photograph comes from a wooden storyboard, which they are pieces of art that are carved in a particular village in Papua New Guinea along the Sepik River. And they often feature sawfish because there were at one time many sawfish in the Sepik River. I think that if we are collecting these types of interview information about culture, we need to think carefully about how best to collect that and where it should be archived. So rather than just keeping it as a bit of kind of extra fun information that that maybe just adds a bit of interest if we're writing an article about our work, if there is the scope to do it, I think it's enormously valuable to include a few questions about culture in your interview or in your focus groups, which are presumably mainly collecting data on ecology or fisheries. And the reason for that is that we have the privilege of being perhaps in a rather remote area or talking to elders in cases where these cultures are sometimes being lost at a very rapid rate. Certainly as regards the cultural importance of sawfishes in Papua New Guinea and also in Ghana, I have found as these animals disappear, the cultural importance of them and the stories or the art connected to these animals also seems to decline. And so for me at least, I feel like it's important to collect information on as much of that as I possibly can, obviously not compromising the biological elements of the study, because there is a crossover between the conservation of species or habitats and the conservation of human culture. So just briefly, I found the process of training a team of interviewers to be really important and to incorporate the reason for the study, get people fascinated, as I said, but also doing a half day of pilot interviews and then getting all the interviewers back together again and having them assess each other's responses allows for people to see what sort of mistakes their neighbor made, and it allows their neighbor to tell them what sort of mistakes they made. And it makes everyone a much better interviewer, I think. And we went through this process in Peru before we started our study on sawfishes there. And I think it really, really helped the team of interviewers, who were mostly students from the local university, to get a much better handle on what they'd be looking at, the types of data they'd be looking at when they finished the study and came to analysing those data. And it made them better interviewers. Also translation, it's great to do this in a discussion session with the locals rather than just getting a translator to translate your questionnaire, because if people understand the context and the purpose of your study, they're likely to be able to help you translate your questions in a much better way. And tell stories. People love hearing about sawfish stories from other places, about the kind of things that you found out in another part of the country or in another country. And they also love hearing about cultural beliefs and the traditions associated with an animal in a different country. I find people to be completely fascinated by that. So if you can tell those stories at all, that really kind of hooks people and draws them into the process that you want to engage them in. So finally, in terms of opportunities of this human dimensions approach, I do think that it starts the decolonization process. It allows the experiences of people in fishing communities to be recognized as a body of really important knowledge. And you know, it's invaluable, the knowledge that we can get from these types of study. And it also allows for a far broader understanding of social, political, economic and cultural contexts in which we can then develop more effective conservation strategies. I just want to say finally that I do think that the communication of results is super important, so that interviewees can see where the information they have provided has gone, how it's been used. You know, if they gave you an hour of their time, then it's kind of a gesture of respect to show people what that hour and what the information they gave you has contributed to. And it ensures that the transfer of information is not one way from interviewee to interviewer, but that information also gets shared back to the interviewees. This then in turn helps people go from just knowing about their own experience, be that with swordfish or sharks or whatever you're asking them about, to seeing a much broader picture, either of what's happening in their community or possibly to a global context. And it's also a token of appreciation. I think there are a lot of different ways that you can show appreciation to interviewees. Some people bring gifts. I find this a little bit challenging in some very impoverished communities where I work, because I don't want to bring people sort of meaningless tokens, but I also can't necessarily contribute massively to their livelihoods. But I think that by at least sharing the information back with them, that's a token of appreciation and really allows you to show them that you valued their input. So yeah, in terms of communication, this photo is from Guinea-Bissau, and I was just really intrigued by how captivated local people that I was talking to, both kids and adults, were just with a laminated sheet I have of photos of different animals on it. And that intrigue that I saw again and again in communities to printed color materials and images of animals was what led me to develop The King of the Fishes, which is a little educational book that I produced for communities in Madagascar and Mozambique. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ruth. It's been such a great talk, and it's stimulated a lot of discussion in the chat, which I think you'll have time to look through now.
Yeah, sorry I went over time.
No problem. So I think we'll just go straight into the next talk, which is by Isa.
Yes, so I'm going to quickly jump in. I think Isa's internet connection is a little bit unstable. I've noticed he's been sort of popping in and out of the chat. So I'm going to go ahead and play a recording of Isa's presentation from my laptop, but hopefully Isa is going to be available for questions and for the facilitated discussion at the end. So if you do have any questions, pop them in the chat, and then hopefully Isa can respond to them when he's able to get online and his connection is more stable. So I'm just going to go ahead and find that presentation. I think I'm going to have to take my headphones off and play it loud on my laptop as well. So hold on a second.
Hi everyone, and good morning from Ghana. I'm Mr. Said. I'm currently a PhD candidate at the Karnad University of Science and Technology, and I have been studying shark fisheries in Western Ghana for the past 2 years, and it's a pleasure having me to talk about some of the key findings that have got me so far. So I'll be presenting on the topic, using the ecological knowledge to fill in the gaps for Ghana's shark fisheries. Actually, Ghana has been ranked as a major electronic fishing nation in the West African sub-region, as electronic fishery represent key source of livelihoods to some of the poorest Ghanaian coastal communities. It provides a major source of employment, income, as well as sustenance to some of these communities. However, the less movements are under precarious state stemming from diverse anthropogenic disturbances, including overfishing, and marine habitat degradation and pollution, which are occurring uncontrollably along the coastline of Ghana. Also, key baseline information that are needed to detect population decline, and also to devise management strategies, especially in the socio-ecology, population parameters, as well as socio-economic and trade dynamics, are virtually non-existent in Ghana, and this impedes the sustainable management of the species. So again, this background, I aim to depend on local ecological knowledge, specifically on the fisher force and the traders of the last branch in Ghana. So for the purpose of this presentation, I'll be providing information on the ecological factors that affect lesbian fishers operation, the historical and current records of the status of sharks and rays. I also will be providing key information on socio-economic impact of lesbian fisheries, the fishers and traders' livelihoods. So this study was conducted in key Elasmovan fishing communities in Western Ghana, and these were the Azim, Disco, Buzia, Adra, and Shama communities, all located along the west coast of Ghana. So I actually did extensive community interaction, where I had in-depth interactions with the chief fishers and the elders in the various communities to discuss the rationale of the projects, as well as the objectives of it. And I also took the opportunity to ask for their permission to conduct this study in their various landing sites. I also had a series of meetings with the personnel from the Fisheries Commission to discuss the project and how this project can contribute in providing key information to develop management strategies to safeguard these species. I further identified various local volunteers in their respective communities to aid me in the data collection. And this was very critical because during our reconnaissance survey, we realized that most of the fisher folks were hostile towards us because they are aware of the global controversy surrounding sharks. And most of them were also aware of the illegalities on their fishing activities. For example, in Ghana, under the fisheries law, it is illegal to target or catch dolphins. And these dolphins are invariably used as bait to target these shark species. And the fisher folks, knowing all these dynamics surrounding their fisheries, it became difficult for them to open up to us. And therefore, we depended on the local volunteers to help us organize series of meetings with the fisher folks and traders to discuss about the project and also to win their trust for the project. So I used the participant observation and I conducted a series of face-to-face interviews with active and retired fishers as well as traders. I also used the participatory appraisal method, specifically a trend analysis, to collect data on decadal changes in abundant trends of sharks and ray species. And I also conducted 5 focus group discussions, 1 per each community, to validate key information from the interview. So I used a convenient sampling scheme to select active fishers for the interview. While the snowball sampling scheme was used to track down retired fishers who mostly double as canoe owners in their respective communities. And in all, I interviewed a total of 33 respondents, and these comprised of 16 active fishers and 17 retired fishers. So the interview question focused on fishing practices, local ecological knowledge, specifically on ecological variables shaping their fishing operations. I also collected data on changes in body sizes and composition, as well as decadal changes in abundance of sharks and rays since 1980. So for the decadal changes in abundant trends of these species, I employed the fisher folk to characterize the abundance of each species into abundant, common, depleted, and severely depleted from 1980 to 2020 using 10 stones. I then converted this abundant category into weighted score using the formula. Category rate, 10% value over 100, where percentage value represent the percentage of respondents which are reporting this abundance category. And the category rate was also a standard index from 0 to 1, where 0 represents species that was categorized as extinct, and 1 represents species categorized as abundant. So the interview data we analyze qualitatively using content analytical approach. So I found out that fishes in Azim, Discove and Shama community were predominant in the use of big GS, and these GS were mostly used in the open ocean to target sharks. However, fishes in Busia and Adwa were also predominant in the use of the bottom set GS, and these GS were mostly used in the coastal habitat to target rays, fish, and other demersal species. So fishes were able to describe 6 categories of local knowledge that were used as ecological clues in shaping their fishing operations. And these were the moon phenomenon, the season weather condition, the beta, seabirds and fish movement, color of seawater and sea current. So over 94% of these fishes reported that the moon affects their ability to catch sharks. And to them, the best and effective period to go fishing is when there is partial or low moon, as it made the water opaque, which prevents schools of fish from sea and escaping from the GS. And all fishes are interviewed also indicated that the bait types influence the catch of abundant sharks. And to them, the best and effective bait is the use of dolphin, followed by flying fish and tunas. So majority of the fishes indicated that July to September was the harvesting season for sharks, and the breeding season for sharks was reported as March to June. And August to October was also reported as the harvesting season for rays and betta fish. 88% of these fisherfolk reported that the sea bears play a key role in giving them ecological clues to potential fishing areas. And to them, whenever they see flocks of sea bears hovering on the surface of the water, it's an indication of abundant fish in that particular area, and therefore they set their net in that particular fishing ground. And majority of the fishers were able to describe 2 major sea currents that affect their fishing expedition. And this was the eastward current, which they said very slow, and therefore provide them favorable conditions for catching more sharks and other pelagic species. The westward current, they said, was very strong, and therefore drift sharks and other pelagic species away from their fishing grounds and do not provide them good conditions for fishing. Majority of the fishers also stated that the number of sharks and ray species have declined tremendously now, and the size have also decreased over the years, and that they are now catching less variable shark and ray species now as compared to the previous years when they began fishing. And declared abundant trends of DGM fisheries. Almost all shark species were actually abandoned in the 1980s with a rated score of more than 0.8. And as of the 2020, all shark species have significantly depleted except the Prunus gluca and mobila species, which fishers reported as common in their catch. So species such as Megapon beveristris and Alopa species were reported as showing signs of depletion in the 2010s. For the bottom certain fishes, all ray species were actually abandoned in the 1980s with a rated score of 1. And as of the 2020s, all ray species have significantly depleted, except for Titroguan species and Raja Pava, which were reported as common in fishers' catch. So Glucostegos semicolors and Rabatos are were reported as showing signs of depletion in the 2000s and 2010s respectively. And for objective 2, that is the socio-economic attributes of shark fisheries. Here, I used the convenient sampling scheme to select fishers and traders in Azim and Shama and Disco communities, which appears to be key shark fishing communities in Western Ghana. And I interviewed a total of 85 respondents using the face-to-face interviews. So I interviewed a total of 85 respondents. And this constituted 58 fishers and 27 traders. The interview question focused on main uses, sale price of commercially important shark products, a trade analysis including where the meat and fins are sold, and satisfaction level of fisher flows and traders. So many fishers and traders reported that they generated between 80 to 100% of their income from sharks species. And to them, many of the fishers and traders generated between 80 to 100% of their income from shark fisheries. And this was more pronounced in Azim and Disco communities, where over 65% of the fisher folks reported of getting more than 80% of their income from sharks. So hammerhead sharks and bull shark were consistently the most valuable shark species in the local market, whilst treasure sharks and blue sharks were reported as the least valuable shark species in the local market. So 67% of these fisher folks reported that they sell their fins to foreign merchants from Benin, Senegal, Guinea, and Mali, and this was so because these foreign merchants provided them good prices as compared to the local merchants. Satisfaction level of fishers and traders. 60% of these fishers indicated that they were disgruntled with the income they get from selling their meat. 90% of these fishers were also satisfied. So 90% of these traders, however, 90% of these traders were satisfied with their income from shark meat. And 75%, 95% of these fishers and traders respectively were satisfied with their work in fishing because they see their work as the last available safety net and therefore tend to be okay with it. So what's next after this? We aim to collect key data in other regions of Ghana, especially in Greater Accra and Central region, and then link up with key personnel in the Fisheries Commission, as well as local governmental organizations to develop conservation strategies for these species. We also aim to create awareness on the plight of sharks and rays in key shark or less mobile fishing communities in Ghana. Thank you for your attention.
Okay, so I think I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And I think hopefully Isa is here. So if you do have any questions for him, please feel free to pop those in the chat.
And I think while we are waiting for questions for him, maybe we can go ahead and hear from Sarah. Sarah, are you here? Hi.
Hi, sorry. Yes, I am here. Do I start?
Yes, please.
Okay. Hi, everyone. It's nice to meet you all, and thank you for attending the third day. Give me 1 second to share my screen. And I will turn off my camera for internet connection to be better, if you don't mind. Okay. Let me first introduce myself. I am Sarah Mabruk, founder of Marine Biology in Libya Society, and for now I am leading the Angiosha project in Libya. I will speak today about how we can using social media to combine awareness raising with research. Lessons from Angiosha in Libya. First, at the outset, let me give you two important reasons why make the use of social media, especially Facebook, is very important in our project, as well as in any other project have here in Libya from my point of view. As you see, this is Libya map, and Libya coastline occupies about 36% of the southern coast of Mediterranean Sea. It's extend for 1,770 kilometers, and therefore it's difficult to monitor all fishing activity by the regular way. And the second reason that the current population of Libya is approximately 7 million people, and more than 72% of Libyan using social media, especially Facebook. And in fisher community, we have more than 20 fishing group on Facebook, actively fishing group. You can find there all fishermen kinds, professional, recreational, free dive, scuba dive, and all of them their discussion about the fishing method. They exchange their experiment about the sea and the fish, and it's interesting because they always upload all fishing catch in the fishing group. I will talk now about the Angiosha project in Libya. We started in the late of 2020. Actually, the Angiosha project in Libya started literally by a picture. When a recreational fisherman sent me a picture for 3 individuals of Angiosha, and then I shared it with my friend Yanis from IC, and for it's like snowball. I participate in a workshop in Tunisia, and organized by the Shark Trust. And after that, we decide to apply for the Save Our Sea Small grant, and we now finish the Angiosha project in Libya, the field survey, and try to gather all information we get from the questionnaire. But there is an important goal in the aim of and objectives of the Angiosha project in Libya. The importance of Libya as hotspot for Angiosha in the Mediterranean Sea is highlighted on social networks. So we use the social network to introduce awareness campaign through the Facebook in the fishing group, and that was very interesting for us. We depend on our work in fisher desire to gain knowledge. We provide the knowledge by sharing some information about Angiosha through our page. Through our page and our page, we are a source of fisher information, and fishermen are source of data for us. And since the Angiosha is caught in large quantity here in Libya, we must pay close attention to the language we use to raise awareness about it. We don't attack the fishermen who fishing the Angiosha. We try to give him many reasons to explain why we should conservation this species, especially with the difficult economic situation, and we try through our best to clarify the importance of this species in ecological balance and why it must be returned to the sea. I will tell you how we manage this process. First, we post some information about Angiosha, how you can identification it, habits, distribution, and then share it with all fishing group, Libyan group, with the request of fishermen and those interested to share with us photos of angel shark they took while fishing, diving, or visiting the fish market. After that, the fishermen or interested people sent to us communication with us with the page directly. Other one, they leave the comments on the post have been shared in the group. For the fishermen who contact directly to the page, it's very easy because you can just ask him the main question, where you catch it, how you catch it, and the debate. But for who leave their comments on the post in the group, we shared in the group, we began to write to them to collect the base information, which the main information, the location, the fishing gear, and the debit. What the benefits for using social media and collecting data for any species we spoke about? We use this method not just for angel shark. We do it for all shark and rays in Libya. First, big database for angel shark fishing. From we started in 2020, we have more than 100 records from the social media for the angel shark fishing. Establish connection network with the fishermen as stakeholder. This is help us in our field work. The data gathered from social media help us to identify the main hotspot, which help us a lot in the field work. You know, Libya, it's long coastline, so there's many ports, and when we collect the data from the Facebook, we know we must work in just 3 ports, Tripoli and Benghazi and Misrata. As you see, this a picture for the angel shark we gathered from the Facebook. It's from along the coastline, one from the west and 2 from the middle of Libya and the other from the east of Libya. When we're using the social media and raising awareness, we actually have a great feedback from the fishermen. First, when anyone from fishermen upload his photos catching the angel shark, we following the response of the fishermen, we found them remember him. It's this creature is endangered, critical endangered species. You must return it to the sea. Raising the local knowledge of fishermen and citizens about the critical endangered species in Libya water. It's before we start our work, the word critical endangered species in Libya was unknown. Now, after we start the awareness campaign on angel shark and every shark and ray in Libya, which critical endangered, people know what meaning it's critical endangered. It's meaning we must protect it. We must return it to the sea. Encourage the fishermen and citizens to report about fishing or observation angel shark species in the fish market. After the awareness campaign, people start to send for us the picture for cutting angel shark and offer to sell in the fish market, and this help us a lot to go visit this fish market and distribute our awareness poster about the angel shark. Angel shark release campaign leading by many fishermen to encourage others to conservation of this species in Libyan water. After our awareness campaign start, fishermen to release the angel shark. We have many videos. I take shot from this video, if you can see her. This one from the West Libya, from Garibaldi coast, a juvenile for the Squatina oculata had been released, and this one from the east of Libya for Squatina had been released from the fishermen. Step we try now to prepare a handling guidelines for shark and rays by the collaborator of the Shark Trust. Using this handling guidelines, improving handling practice can have a significant impact on the survival of shark and rays that have been captured. And we will release soon the Mediterranean Angiosha Shark Sub-Regional Action Plan for the Southern Union Sea by the Shark Trust. This roadmap is designed to focus efforts to help restore these enigmatic species to robust population in the region. Hope the short presentation was enough to understand how we can use the social media in any project. If you need any help, you can contact with me in Facebook or my email or WhatsApp. And thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Sarah. I think we are now at the point where all our speakers who are here in person, or rather here live on Zoom, have spoken. So maybe we can start with the questions and the facilitated discussion by Vanessa Jaite. And then those who still have time can stay back for the video recorded version of Mia Ivani's talk. And this talk will definitely be on the final recorded version of this of today's session, which we will be uploading onto the SSG's Vimeo page. So we'll go ahead with the discussion now, and we will continue after the discussion with Mia Ivani's talk. Vanessa, would you like to take over now?
Yeah, sure. How much time have we still got? Is it just 15 minutes or?
Yeah, 15 minutes.
Yeah, okay, cool. All right, well, thanks to you and Hollie for inviting me to facilitate the discussion. I see there's lots of questions already been asked and answered, which is fantastic. Well, I guess we'll just go in the order that the speakers went. And Hollie and Divya invited me to sort of blend in some of my own experiences, which are quite a ways away in time now. So I noticed one question regarding how you disseminate research findings to your communities, and someone suggested WhatsApp is a great option, and I thought that is a great option. That wasn't available when I did my research, so I'm feeling a bit old now. But Ruth, thank you very much for your super fascinating talk. It was just really nice to be back in that space of interviews, and I resonated with a lot of what you said. I want to thank you especially for raising the point of acknowledging our privilege of being able to conduct research like that. And particularly so before the pandemic, when we could travel quite a lot, which is very expensive. Yeah, when I did my fieldwork, I was 26, and I did my fieldwork in quite remote parts of Eastern Indonesia. And often fishers would say to me, "We don't understand why you're here. Shouldn't you be home in a nice country, married and having kids, sort of living a nice life?" And yeah, I sort of tried to explain why I was passionate about sharks and remote places, but I don't think they quite understood. And then when I managed to convince a few fishers to take me fishing with them, when we came back 2 days later, their wives. So, you know, people always ask me when I sent in papers and sort of described this, a lot of the reviewers would say, you know, didn't you run into cultural issues with their wives? And it's like the opposite. They all said, you poor thing, how are you doing? Are you okay? Why do you do this to yourself? So yeah, it's quite funny. But yeah, also the point Ruth made about having to understand barriers to engaging communities in conservation, and particularly when communities are really quite poor and struggling, conservation is really a long way down on their list of priorities, if it's at all on there. So we need to be quite aware of that. But yeah, in my own experience, I also noticed sometimes it's a matter of being very mindful of cultural expectations. I did a bit of field work once with another young woman who struggled to dress in a way that was acceptable or that felt natural, I think, to the respondents in the Muslim community that we worked in. And after a few days, some of the fishers said to me, you know, could you tell your friend that it was really confusing to us that we can see so much of her skin, and to us it wasn't a lot of skin, but it still was to them. And she sort of said to me, I just feel asexual here. She didn't feel feminine enough, and I still had to tell her, you still just need to dress up a bit more and cover up more. And so yeah, it's very important to do that. And I'm about to embark on a project now that hasn't got to do with sharks, but I'll be interviewing people again. And I've only got 8 months for it. And I realized I have a bit of anxiety, because when I did this for my PhD, I spent the best part of 2 years in 3 communities. And I really lived there and got to know the people. And it's so helpful for so many other aspects that can then flow into your interviews. Just to build that rapport with a community and with people, and to know how they live and what they consider to be normal and what not. I mean, I used to have people watching me brush my teeth, which seemed to be just the greatest form of amusement to them. So yeah, taking that time, I think, to really get to know your community is very important, and also very difficult when you have very little funding. Yeah. Another point was raised about being aware of the familiarity of your communities with conservation work. After I left Indonesia, I worked in Palau, and there was a community there that had been interviewed by every NGO you can imagine, and many researchers. So interview fatigue was a really important factor, and people started giving totally different answers to different researchers. I think just because they were fed up with always being interviewed, and very rarely getting any feedback afterwards as well. So they didn't really see the point of giving out this information.
Vanessa, I think that's a really important point. And I've worked in a place where people have been interviewed, you know, at least once a year for multiple years. And I think it's super important for us all as researchers to remember that, and to try and, you know, think not just about our own work, but about what's happened before, and also through networking to try and understand what might happen in the future, and to minimize people's exposure to multiple interviews, because it takes up their time. It gets very wearying for them. It reduces the quality of the data that we get as researchers, because like you said, people get very fed up. And yeah, like you also raised, like if people made more of an effort to actually communicate the results back to people, then I think it's more of a nourishing two-way flow of information. But if it's just constant taking, it doesn't really benefit anyone. So thanks for raising that.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's a really important point. And then it also gets into, how do you then relate to your interviews that you can sense whether they are tired? I think and I saw you answered that too in an answer you posted. It does depend a lot on character too, and how well you can relate to your opposite. Yeah, I sort of had the opposite. Wasn't a problem, but the fishers I spoke to, some of them said that even my wife hasn't asked me these questions. She's not even as interested. So they were so glad that someone was finally asking them. And I even had some fishers pay scribes, I think they're called, like people when fishers couldn't write well themselves, and they would pay someone to write in absolutely immaculate handwriting a list of all of the gear and equipment that they would need from the Australian government, because they thought that I could go to the Australian Prime Minister and get help for them. So yeah, I guess sort of navigating the expectations is an important and a sometimes very difficult part, because just like sometimes we don't mean the same thing when we talk about overfishing, for example. There's very different ideas of what a researcher can actually achieve. But like you, Ruth, I definitely feel guilt about not having been able to return to my study communities, and I still definitely want to do that at some point, but I'm so far away from them now, and yeah, it seems difficult to do. But for things like that, social media is really wonderful, because I've managed to keep in touch with some of the young people in those communities, and I can at least send regards to everyone that way and send them photos of my children, and they're happy now that I'm finally living the life that they thought I should have lived when I was 27. And I also was laughing when you talked about images that don't always help, because some Indonesian fishers used to tell me, I'd show them photos of Will White. He produced a guide to sharks in Indonesia, and it had photos of sharks. And they would tell me, this photo is wrong. That's not how this shark looks like. And then they also actually sometimes showed me sharks that they would catch that weren't supposed to be occurring there. And later I worked with a colleague of mine, Paolo Momigliano, and we did some genetic analysis of tissue samples that I asked the fishers to collect. And it turned out that indeed they actually occurred there, and we just didn't know it. So it can go both ways. It's really enriching if you can manage to do that sort of, I guess, collect data from different sources. And I also really related to the embarrassing your interviewees. I always try to create a bit of privacy for the interviewees, but sometimes it just happened that there was a participant and he was surrounded by all his peers, and if I'd ask him, how old are you? And he'd say 85, but he didn't look a day over 35. And everyone would laugh at him and say, he didn't go to school. He doesn't even know how old he is. And you would see the participants sort of, giving an embarrassed smile, but you really sort of thought, I didn't want him to get into that situation. And so you have to work out how to navigate that, I guess. Yeah, there's a lot of learning by doing. Yeah, a lot of my respondents also said that they thought the sharks had run away, and I sometimes sort of poked a bit and said, well, do you think it's possible that you fished so many of them that there are none left? And they said no, because just imagine someone came to your village and they would take all your children away. Wouldn't you also run away? You wouldn't just stay and wait till they've taken every last one of your people. And so yeah, some interesting discussions there. And the same about declines. I would ask, have certain species declined? And they would say, no, they haven't. But then when I said, well, how many hammerheads did you catch per trip in say the 1990s or during the Asian financial crisis? And they would say, oh, we would catch like 50 per trip, and now we only catch 3. And then I'd say, well, so they've declined, right? And they would go, yeah, you're right. We've never thought about it that way. Yeah, so sometimes I guess it's a question of asking something in a different way, or like you also said, Ruth, using different time brackets to help people remember. And that's actually a question I had for Isa. How did you ask? And I'm sorry if I missed you actually mentioning that, but did you also use, I guess, important events in time to help your respondents remember or think back to the time that you asked them about, or did you just use the years and everybody knew what you were talking about? I don't know if Isa is here actually. Oh, there are too many people to scroll through, but Isa, if you're here, you can say something.
I think he's here. He's in the list, but I
Yeah.
don't know how reliable the connection is. I think he's just disappeared again.
Okay. Maybe a question for Sarah. I was wondering, I guess that's something a lot of people get asked all the time, especially women, but have you ever felt that there were certain benefits or disadvantages to being a woman working with mostly male fishers?
Hi. Actually, yes, because in the culture here in Libya, the lady, you must respect the lady. You're the woman. You deal with them with some softy. First time I visit the Benghazi port, they like, what? There is woman work in the related to the sea. I know the local name of the fish. I know what's the difference between the fish, and that actually helped me because they be more collaborative with me in our project, and feeling that they must help me because I am woman, not let me. And even the male with me in the team, if they want to go to the field, they ask me if I can go with them to make everything easy. They respect women here, so it's make our work easy, but it's more challenge because you can't just go to the boat and see seer in the sea. It's something we have do something, and we can do other things. So it was a good and easy for me for the first time I visit the field work.
Yeah, that's interesting. Thank you, Sarah.
Sure.
I'm just reading here in the chat, Michelle was saying, I find that women that I have hired get a better treatment, more attention, and more time during interviews, but it would depend on the country, I suppose.
Yeah, but as you mentioned, and I think you speak about the clothes in Africa and the skin, and when your friend was work there, even me, if I go to the field work, I must to wear suitable clothes. So it's the nature, I think.
Yeah, I think it is a fine line between,
Yeah.
shouldn't she be at home having children and doing woman stuff, and also, oh, I get to talk to a woman and tell her all my worries. I did try to train a team of interviewees in one of the communities I worked in. And I noticed that except for one man who was really quite, I think he was very sensitive, and he was able to really sit with fishers and sort of make it feel like a tea time chat. But a lot of the other men were just very, I don't know, I felt like they couldn't quite get past that barrier of really seeing the fishers as an equal or someone to learn from. And they came at them almost with this arrogant attitude of, well, I'm from a university and I'm studying, and I'm just gonna sort of fire these questions at you and not even really listen. One thing I try to always tell these interviewers was to not guess the answers. So if someone's sort of waiting or pausing, to just have the patience to wait and not sort of put the words in their mouth. But I found that too often that still happened. And in the end, I was so frustrated that I just said, I just have to learn Indonesian well enough to do these interviews by myself.
But for me, I think it's a different case, because before I started the field work in the Angiosha, I had founded the Marine Biology in Libya website. It was like educational website. So I have dealing with from 2017 with the fishermen on Facebook. So they actually know me. They know Sarah from Facebook. And when I came to them in the board or in the fishing site, it was like I know them from long time. So it's make everything easy. I know them. I say congratulations when they pass in the school, when their children succeed in the school. So this like they know me, I know them. So it's make my work easy when I get to the field.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
I think I would need to step in here. Sorry, Vanessa.
That's fine.
Because we are sort of running short on time and we still need to have Mia's presentation. So maybe we can move on to that. And then if we still have people here who want to stay on and discuss further, we can do that.
Yeah, I'm going to try and play Mia's video from my laptop again. And I think, if people want to stay on, then please do. And if you want to continue the discussion in the chat, then also feel free. I'm going to try to play this without having to no, maybe I can't do it. I was going to say I'm going to try and play this without having to play it out loud on my laptop, but that might take a bit too long to work out. So I'm just gonna do the way I know.
Hello, my name is Mia Iwane. I'm a social scientist at the Joint Institute for Marine and Atmospheric Research. I'm based in Honolulu, Hawaii, and I work in affiliation with NOAA's Pacific Islands Fisheries Science Center. Today, I'm going to talk about how I've applied a socio-political lens to shark research and conservation. And I use that lens to think about the different problem definitions that stakeholders have for shark issues, quote unquote, and the implications that has for our solutions. First, what do I mean by problem definition? Problem definition is recognized in the literature as an analytical tool. It's this first step we take to frame the problem before we attempt to resolve it or design policies to address it. And it's also recognized as a political process because just as we make decisions about whose narratives and voices to include in that process, we also make decisions about whose voices to exclude. And we know that stakeholders' problem definitions are partial and diverse because they're developed through specific experiences, institutional and cultural backgrounds, and biases. So recognizing that helps us to be more deliberate about how we negotiate different problem definitions and then forge productive pathways forward. From the human-wildlife conflict literature, we know that conservation goals can be compromised if we fail to consider social, political, and cultural contexts for these kinds of issues. For example, if we fail to consider human agency and behavior, the cultural significance maybe of some of these animals, or even the political hierarchies that exist between and among stakeholder groups. We also know that those kinds of simplistic problem definitions can be fertile ground for wildlife to inherit symbolic meaning. So a wolf might typically represent to a farmer a threat to livestock, but depending on how wolf populations and farmers are managed, depending on how farmers relate to managers even, a wolf can come to symbolize maybe the assertion of federal and state power, preservation interests, or the interests of privileged stakeholder groups. And when wildlife inherits these symbolic political contexts, animosity toward those managed species can persist even after the human-wildlife interaction itself has been mitigated. Stepping back and looking at the many different ways people might think about a problem helps us to develop more robust and sustainable solutions for both people and wildlife. My work has focused on understanding interactions between sharks and small-scale, mostly small boat fishing communities in the Pacific Islands region. So as I do my work, I'm thinking about how different stakeholders are thinking about the fisher-shark interaction problem and its context, and how those different problem definitions might affect the utility and effectiveness of different solutions that we're exploring. I conducted 2 case studies in West Hawaii and the Mariana Archipelago. The first of these was on the west coast of Hawaii Island, or Big Island in the main Hawaiian island chain. And that fieldwork was conducted in 2017 and 18. In 2019, I traveled to the Mariana Archipelago to conduct fieldwork there. I visited 2 U.S. territories, Guam, which is the southernmost island in the Mariana Archipelago, and 3 islands in the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands. The 3 inhabited are Saipan, Tinian, and Rota. Okay, this table represents the number of stakeholders I collected data from across case studies and islands. Primarily, I collect my data through semi-structured interview. I audio record those, transcribe them, and analyze my data that way. But I also attended, when I could, meetings hosted by members of the fishing community. That's what this photo illustrates. I intercepted folks at marinas, and I attended meetings hosted by the Western Pacific Regional Fishery Management Council, some of their advisory panels and committees. And observing those really helped me to understand how different stakeholders interact with one another, the language that they use with one another, and sort of the dynamics that contextualize fisheries issues in these regions generally. As we're thinking about problems and solutions associated with fisher-shark interactions, there are some that are probably coming to mind already. So let's go through those. The first is sharks' impacts to fisheries. We can think about loss of catch, gear, or generalized decrease in fishing efficiency. And as one fisher put it, if you could wave the magic wand, please go away, shark, you would. So this represents a great opportunity to innovate and collaborate with fishers to find this win-win solution, some kind of mitigation tool, but it's not available yet. We also have the impacts of humans on sharks. And there are a couple common tools that are used to address this. One is outreach and education, right? So there's this idea that if we deliver information to an audience, it might change their hearts, minds, and behavior. And we did have examples of this in our research where fishers' behavior changed as they learned new information about sharks' vulnerability. But more commonly, fishers reference a complex set of variables that dictate how they'll make decisions and behave on the water. So this fisher noted, if it comes between supporting my family and the one shark, I'm going to put a bullet in it. And interviewees cited various examples. This one is sort of an economic calculus, a calculus that involves his family's well-being. Other people talked about how we treat a shark might depend on if there are other boats in the area, or it might depend on if we caught anything else that day. Regulation is another commonly used tool here. In our region, we have limited enforcement capacity. And so if the regulation is implemented without buy-in or receptivity from the community that's being managed, that regulation can effectively be a suggestion that angers people. Right? It widens that divide between managing institutions and those being managed, and can further complicate our efforts to conserve sharks, but also cooperate with fishing communities. We can start to see some of the benefits of a socio-political lens already, which is that it allows us to situate stakeholder perceptions and relationships within larger shark research and conservation efforts, and vice versa. And that allows us to evaluate the utility of some of these more familiar solution pathways, and also illuminate robust solutions that we might have otherwise missed. Shifting now to our sociopolitical problems and solutions, and I'll break this down by case study because there are a couple differences that I think will be helpful. The first is that the quote-unquote shark issue was associated in West Hawaii with not too much. We sort of had a clean slate to work from there, and so when we approached members of the fishing community about collaborating with us on these research endeavors, some of them responded, "This is the first time I've actually thought about sharks." They're not as much of a target species as other fish, and so fishers describe devoting relatively little observational power to sharks as opposed to something like a tuna. What we did have to do in West Hawaii was invest more in engagement efforts up front because fishers there weren't as primed to think about how shark research and talking about sharks might be relevant to them. So in contrast, fishers in the Marianas were really primed to talk about their shark perceptions and observations because the shark issue was already associated with some level of stakeholder conflict. Fishers from that community had been expressing their concerns about shark interactions having increasing impact through time on their fisheries, and they had been reporting those concerns for a number of years already. Their responses from the research and management community sort of left them feeling dismissed and frustrated. And so we did have to focus more on language that would unify those stakeholders and help them move forward in that discussion. This differential between the knowledge and power of different stakeholders in these case studies was a common theme between West Hawaii and the Marianas. And so there was this conflict between fishers' experiential knowledge and the more formalized knowledge of the research community. And what comes up again and again between these groups is this sort of resignation and frustration on both sides, right? Like, their reality is different from mine, and I don't know how to reconcile it. In the Marianas, this manifested as fishers largely perceived shark abundance to be increasing, and this conflicted with researchers' assessment that some sharks' abundance was decreasing through time. As this fisher researcher put it, if you're just doing a snorkel transect and you're not doing anything to attract the sharks, then of course you think they're not there. So there's opportunity to explore the different stimuli or conditions under which researchers and fishers are making their observations and assumptions to better understand shark behavior and research. And there are also clear power differentials between stakeholders. Researchers and managers have specific access to decision-making. This fisher said, from Guam, we're just a territory. Spending any money out here from a government standpoint is like, oh, we can use it better than that. They won't come and study where people are living and where it affects people's lives. We're always getting the short end of the stick. So whether it's acquiring and allocating funding, dedicating research staff to an issue, or dictating fisheries regulations, managers and researchers have formal types of power that fishers don't, despite it affecting many times directly fishers' lifestyles and livelihoods. So there's this recurring theme where fishers perceive managers and scientists to be sort of sitting in their desks remotely, making decisions that won't impact them. A couple solution components that have been helpful for me to address these kinds of sociopolitical issues in our case studies. One is transparent communication. So I've learned to be very explicit about my intent as a researcher, what my funding sources are, and who I might be beholden to in that sense. And because I'm a scientist, I have come accustomed to thinking through how my science could grow legs after it leaves my desk, how it might be used by managers, other researchers, members of the public, NGOs. And Be very explicit about the risks that might pose to people that you are cooperating with and relying on. Also helpful is collaborative research. In our case studies, this has been helpful in increasing researchers' access to data, right, in recruiting fishers' participation and time on the water to collect that data. So it improves also the efficiency of data collection, and there's been an exchange of information and knowledge both ways between fishers and researchers. Last thing, a lot of this is about stakeholder perceptions, conflict, relationships, and this can feel tangential to the sharks that we might be focused on, can feel nebulous, but we have the opportunity to transform these problem framings into novel solutions as well. In West Hawaii, we found that relationship building could impact fishers on the water decisions. This interviewee noted that he encountered an oceanic white-tip shark and thought, oh, I'd kill him, but then he thought about me and decided against it. In the Marianas, where the shark issue is entrenched with fishers feeling dismissed and marginalized, particularly in their relationship with the US federal government, one fisher focused on the importance of the government responding to community concerns in a way that demonstrated their commitment, right? So how many man hours and dollars are spent, that's guaranteed and tangible. We can say we learned a lot more, shoot, we tried everything, but the sharks are still doing it. There's still a problem on the water. But again, it's a matter of demonstrating that commitment to the community and to the territories. To wrap up, I'll just recap the benefits of applying a sociopolitical lens to shark conservation and research. The first is that it expands our definition of the problem, which in itself is an act of inclusion. That inclusion of multiple stakeholder perspectives in how we see the problem can help to address power imbalances and stakeholder inequities. The sociopolitical lens can also help us to avoid solution pathways that may underperform or exacerbate conflict between stakeholders or between fishers and sharks. And finally, that lens highlights novel opportunities to address sociopolitical issues that we may initially write off as tangential and irrelevant to sharks. Unsurprisingly, this can benefit stakeholder relationships, but it also has benefits to the research that we do and the conservation interests that we have. Thank you so much for including me. Please feel free to reach out if you have questions or want to chat about this work. My contact info is there. Sorry I couldn't attend live, and I hope the rest of the workshop goes smoothly. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was another great presentation in this series of really fantastic presentations by our speakers and our panelists. It's been such deep insights into how to apply the research methods that we were talking about last week, and to talk about the nitty-gritties of how to get things done under different contexts and in different field conditions. We'd love to stay on and continue our discussion, but for now, I think we will close today's session, and those of us who still have the time can feel free to stay on this Zoom link and continue the discussion. So thank you, everyone, and we will see you again tomorrow. Those of us who are staying on can feel free to use the chat or